Glenn Loury, it's great to talk to you again.
It is indeed my pleasure. Here we are at the Glenn Show. This is Glenn Loury of Brown University. I'm talking with Harold Pollack, my frequent partner in conversation here, who is a professor at the School of Social Service Administration at the University of Chicago, and a frequent commentator on things about social policy, inequality, and such in American society. What's up? Ferguson, Missouri is what's up.
Yeah, so what do you think?
And that's right in our wheelhouse, isn't it? That's the kind of stuff you and I talk about all the time, you know, crime, race, urban America, policing, violence, etc. We should have something to say about this one.
Okay, so why don't you start? What do you think about what's going on?
Oh, man, I think a bunch of different things. Okay, so in the first instance, there is Michael Brown, the deceased victim of a police shooting, whose killing has occasioned a huge and sustained angry response from concerned parties who are criticizing not only the Ferguson Township Constabulary, but also more generally the way in which Black people and young Black men in particular are being treated in American cities. Hands up, don't shoot has become their mantra, engendering this image of the police, you know, hunting down and executing without reason, or too frequently employing excessive violence in a contemptuous manner, making life very difficult for young Black men, and not only them in places like Ferguson, Missouri, not only there. So there is that. Then there is the violence, the looting, the firing of weapons and the throwing of projectiles at police, the pleas of community activists and race and civil rights leaders to maintain calm, and so on. So and the deployment of the massive original show of force by police with, you know, military-like weapons and the pointing of guns at people and the heavy-handed moving them along so as to maintain order and so forth, and all the questions raised by that. Then there is the political drama. I mean, many political dramas. District attorney who is being accused of impossible to be unbiased because his father had been killed, his father, a police officer, in an encounter with a Black suspect. There is the governor of Missouri, who has been outspoken and some say prejudicial in his treatment of the case and in some of the moves that he's made, calling in the National Guard, taking the responsibility for order maintenance in Ferguson away from local police and substituting the state police, led by this extraordinary and impressive African-American police officer who's been in charge of security on the ground there. There is the Attorney General, and I'll stop because I'm going on for a while, but there's many layers of stuff here, of the United States flying out to the scene to, I think, express the idea that the federal government, the Department of Justice, is going to be actively involved in getting to the bottom of what happened, making statements that refer to his own race and his own unpleasant experiences with police, being an African-American male in this context, being criticized roundly in the right-wing press. I know you don't watch Fox News, but occasionally I allow myself, necessary for the job that I do. I have to, I have to know what they're saying, and they've been going ballistic over there about what I think they imagine to be a race card of one kind or another that's being played here by the administration. So there are many layers, and I haven't told you what I thought, but I've just kind of sort of covered the terrain. Did I leave anything out?
No, you gave a pretty complete list. Just moving sort of last to first, one of the ironies in the situation is how inhibited the president is by the fact of his Blackness to intercede in this. And he's been very tepid. Of course, he sent the Attorney General, and what he's actually doing is another question. But in terms of his rhetoric and vocal involvement, he's been very constrained, and probably, I think, I would probably, if I were one of his advisors, probably recommend that he be pretty restrained on this because...
Did you see, excuse me for interrupting, but I just want to ask if you saw Ezra Klein's piece on this very issue. Why Obama will not be making a speech about Ferguson, Missouri, or words to that effect as the title.
Yeah, and I've talked to several people. I mean, when I was very involved in the healthcare debate and the Henry Louis Gates thing came up, I was one of the people who said, "Please don't get involved in this. The way that you can help African Americans is by helping, 9 million African Americans or some number like that actually get their health insurance. And if you get enmeshed in the racial politics of an incident like this, it will." You will instantly polarize it in a way that will not, that will not achieve any of the objectives that you want to achieve. And it makes me sad to say that because, of course, I'm sure President Obama has a lot to say about what's going on. I'm sure Attorney General Holder has a lot to say, and it's just such a poignant statement about this moment that it may not be wise.
Let me just ask you something. Mm-hmm. Excuse me for interrupting. Sure. I'm not hearing you as well, so if you could speak up a little bit. But I also want to ask you, when was it that you advised that the president ought not to get involved in a race matter? Was that the Henry Louis Gates affair, or was that something else that you referred to? I just didn't hear you.
The Henry Louis Gates affair. I thought that was something that the president really need. It would be wise to stay away from that and to not use that as a. People were calling for the president to use that as a teachable moment, and I thought that's
to use what? Can you get the microphone closer to your mouth? To use what as a teachable?
Does this sound better?
Yeah, that's much better.
So people were counseling the president to use the Henry Louis Gates incident.
Oh yes, okay.
As an opportunity for a teachable moment, and I thought,
indeed.
This is actually the moment to get millions of people their health insurance and not to allow yourself to be knocked into this other issue, which for reasons we don't have to get into now was not the ideal way to raise many of the issues that need to be spoken about, but not in that way at that moment around this incident. But it is striking. I must say, what strikes me about this entire Ferguson story is, first of all, the unbelievable mistakes and tone deafness of the local law enforcement authorities and of everybody involved in public policy in Ferguson, allowing a city that is 2/3 black or some number like that to have a virtually all-white police force. If there were no issue of police brutality, how did they expect that to work? That is, for years this has been going on. And
do you know anything? Excuse me again for interrupting. I hear you. Mm-hmm. All-white police force, or almost all-white. Yeah. Do you know anything about the efforts of that police department to make outreach to try to bring on black recruits? Do you know if people are taking the exam and not passing it, whether or not people are hired because their uncle worked for the police department, et cetera, et cetera? Has there been a history of concern from the black community about the underrepresentation of blacks on the police force? Has the authorities in Ferguson, have they been responsive to any such? I mean, I hate to talk about this in the vacuum and just presume that the existence of an imbalance in the numbers indicts the administration for insensitivity. It seems to me we owe them more due diligence than that.
I must say I do not know very much about what they've done. It seems to me, though, that they clearly there may well have been efforts to integrate the police force. I don't have any evidence of a discriminatory motive. But the fact is that in a city with this kind of demographic balance, they allowed the police force to be virtually all white for a very long time. And it blew up in their faces and in the faces of the community in a way that was entirely predictable given everything else that was happening. And
let me ask you something about that, if I may. Okay, we're just going to dwell on the racial imbalance in the police department for a minute. Mm-hmm. Why should it be presumed that a well-trained, courteous, professional, sensitive, if you will, progressive police department needs to have racial balance in order to be able to effectively police a black city?
I don't know.
Are we conceding too much, to the racial essentialism that lurks just behind a lot of the public argument in the United States about race. When we just, flat out say, in other words, if the officer is black, but if he has a chip on his shoulder, that's somehow not as much of a problem then as if the officer is white with a smile on his face.
Well, I guess I would say this. I don't know that racial balance is the critical issue compared to other things, but when you have virtually no African American police officers at all, that's a different situation. And I also don't understand how they could do some of the basic functions of policing. How did they do undercover work? How did they do sort of a lot of the day-to-day activities if their police force is all white? It's just, it seems to me that you're sending a message when your entire police force is white. That's very different from the message that you might send with an individual white officer versus an individual black officer. If you go into a hospital and it's, the proportion of African American staff doesn't quite match the proportion of the surrounding community, people don't get upset. If you go into a hospital and everybody that you see except for the janitors is white, that sends a very different signal, and it means something different. And it's not just about the training of the individual people. It's about what has this organization done to make sure that it is really reaching out in a serious way to the people that it is serving.
I agree. I agree with that, Harold. At a functional level, I don't dispute for a minute that the all-whiteness of that department undermines, I think your point about undercover work is very well taken, but it's a much more general point. And even if every police officer behaved well, the perceptions when something like what has happened happens are bound to be askew in virtue of the fact that the thing is in racial imbalance. I agree with all of that. Mm-hmm. But if I may, my question was motivated by a disquiet that I have with our kind of easy sliding into this posture of, it's a black town and there are white police. Obviously, that's a disaster. Having said everything I said and crediting your concerns, I'm still not comfortable with this idea that white people can't police black people. It's the character of their interactions with the populace, not the color of their skin, that matters. Belligerent, asshole black cops exist.
Yes, they do.
I know this firsthand, okay? It's no more pleasant to be roughed up or basically treated poorly by one of them than it is by a white person. So, I've said my piece.
By the way, I think this is where the actual behavior we've observed from this police department is hard to ignore.
Indeed.
And I must say, this I am baffled by their response to this at just about every point, and the sort of incredibly militarized response.
Indeed.
I don't even understand, actually, and several people have made this point before me. There's this Balco book about the militarization of police. I actually think police need to have some kinds of military hardware in this day and age, but most of the hardware that they had seemed completely useless for the actual situation that they were confronting.
For the crowd-controlled dynamic that they were in, given the racial mix of things.
But whatever the racial mix, what good does it do you confronting a crowd to have a guy up on the top of a Humvee with a sniper rifle?
You've been taking gunfire and you're prepared to give in kind, I gather is what they're saying, and you're trying to intimidate and preempt anybody from getting ugly with you. I assume that would be their rationale, but I think you're absolutely right. As many people have said, it was way over the top and it backfired on them. I think that's a general consensus and it's a justifiable.
And I think most of the people who are expert on SWAT teams and so on at a tactical level say that's not even the way that you do that. If you're actually worried about doing counterfire, you don't have a guy sitting in the middle of the street like that, anyway. And it's
So their tactics were not particularly smart.
Yeah, I think if the Chicago Police Department had faced a similar situation, they would have had the capacity for overwhelming force, but they would not have deployed it in that way. Which is not to say that they would have done everything perfectly, but I think they actually have the training and the experience to use that kind of equipment, and they would not have deployed it in that way. And, there's a lot of reason to think that that you're making a crowd much more aggressive when when you're armed up like that, and so clearly, so that colors everything else we've been talking about in this conversation about how we think that police department was trained. Now, the irony, by the way, in this is it's very possible that that the confronting of Michael Brown and the questioning might have been completely appropriate, and that up until the shots were fired, we really don't know what happened.
We don't. I think we have. At least I want to withhold, any kind of sharp statement about it, execution, etc., until the facts are in, and it may be some time before the facts are in. But I did want to just circle back a bit and say that I think we are converging here on a consensus amongst ourselves that if you're going to have a police department in a near-end suburb that is mostly black and substantially poor, but that has an administrative structure that is largely white, perhaps a hangover from some previous time or whatever, you're going to have that situation. And if you can't get your diversity on your police in your police ranks as quickly as you might like, at the very least, you need to train that department in a way to handle that very unique and specific kind of policing situation. You guys are white, this town is black, There are, whatever there are, I don't know the crime statistics, but I assume stuff happens in Ferguson like it happens everywhere else, and the police have to deal with it. But understand that the potential for things to get out of hand is very great, and we have to know how to handle that. And that's a unique problem for a constabulary who are in our position, that is largely white in a black town. And therefore, what? I mean, courtesy becomes very, maintaining the confidence to the extent that you can have it of the populace becomes very critical. Avoiding a situation in which you seem to be, whatever. I mean, profiling or I'm not sure. I'm not a police expert, but it seems to me that there's an imperative there for how you police that, as well as who is policing, that the demographics.
I must say there are some really eerie potential parallels to the south suburbs of Chicago in this story, where you have rapid demographic change, an infusion of low-income minority residents, where there are law enforcement challenges, social service challenges, and where the collective action problems faced by this new transient population allows an existing white population to maintain its political influence over all the civic infrastructure for a very long time. We have low voter turnout, you have people moving in and out in rental housing, and so on. And we're checkerboarded with these little towns. I know the South Chicagoland. If I mention places like Ford Heights and Hazel Crest and Calumet and so on, that is the dilemma.
I don't know what they're like now. I haven't lived in Chicago for 30 years, but I can imagine.
And it's a real challenge. And I think we're actually the political economy overlay on this. Really. I think is in the background in a profound way that shouldn't be overlooked. And by the way, there's no easy solution to this, because the other issue is that Ferguson is actually maintaining a white population to some extent and a white tax base that presumably comes with that. And the dilemma that you have is if you completely flip over political dominance in that town, you could imagine the whites
those people run away,
and which is what's happened in a lot of places, in the Chicago Southland. Often people move to Indiana or they move west, So that is ironic, because a number of the activists out there, Al Sharpton comes to mind, have been urging the locals to register and vote. Your voting power, you're a majority. You can have a black, not a white, administrative, police and mayor and town council and school board and so forth. And the idea that should that happen, the whites, who are on the whole wealthier and paying relatively disproportionately higher share of the freight, would flee, leaving the town even poorer still. I mean, that's ironic and unsettling. It is very unsettling.
Walter Russell I'm sorry to interrupt. Walter Russell Mead made an interesting point in a piece of his I saw recently, where he says, you know what? These police officers are going to expect pensions one of these days. The white ones, the ones who dominate the police force and who are hated by the populace now. And you know who's going to have to pay those pensions? The taxpayers of that jurisdiction, who are going to be largely black and substantially poorer than the preceding population. They will be obligated for decades to pay off the entitlement to the white police officers with whom they have such difficulty.
Absolutely. You can imagine a 52-year-old retired police officer, receiving a pension, in exactly that situation. And a lot of people in that community, facing, unhappily bearing that. By the way, I do agree with Sharpton that it is really important that that the low-income minority residents of Ferguson vote and participate in the political process, and clearly that is that's essential for this situation to be resolved. My friend Jeet here, actually, he does these amazing Twitter essays, actually, where he tweets a series of tweets where and he's this very cosmopolitan Canadian commentator, where he was basically making the point that among many of the people protesting, the social contract between themselves and the local and the state, as represented by the local constabulary, that social contract had broken down, and that therefore they no longer respected the state's monopoly on the use of force. Now, that's not to say that to justify anything, but that's a mentality that actually goes way back in, and he was drawing on E.P. Thompson and, serious historical study of the English crowds and so on. The only way, if the social contract is in such disrepair, the only way to deal with that is by increasing the political authority of the minority residents in that town, and also for the police to back off, because if they respond with greater force, it is in a way that's perceived as illegitimate. That's really going to escalate.
Yeah, it's a downward spiral. Yeah. I see that. Yeah. But a couple of things. I mean, really, did the facts matter a great deal here. Did the demographic transformation from being a white town to being a black town, but remaining with a white police force, require the withdrawal of the presumption of legitimacy from the officers of authority in the town? I mean, okay, again, I hate to speak from ignorance. Perhaps sufficient friction between police and the black community had been festering in Ferguson to such an extent that, and perhaps it so festers in I don't know where, Harlem or East New York, Brooklyn, or the west side of Chicago, or South Central LA to a similar extent. But I don't want to simply concede that one rogue officer or three unfortunate incidents warrants people who are very dependent upon these forces of order. Because after all, there are bad actors in these communities, and the safety of black residents there depends upon police who risk their lives and put themselves in harm's way and in dangerous situations in order to try to keep order around these folks. Is it obvious that in the United States of America here in the 21st century, the facts warrant the populace withdrawing this basic presumption of legitimacy from the organs of the state? I don't see that. If hands up, don't shoot. Black men are in the crosshairs, executed on the city streets. I mean, maybe that's kind of hyperbolic.
Well, I think this is, well, I certainly agree it does not have to happen that way. In fact, where I live is sort of gently tipping towards a very strong African-American majority in a way that has not, that creates some issues, but certainly does not create, anything like what they're seeing in Ferguson. Of course, it's mostly middle-class people, so it's a little different. I think that one of the layers on top of this is the destruction of the economic life of so many low-income African Americans the entire St. Louis area is so struggling.
Yeah.
And, and certainly in the South Chicagoland, where you have the complete destruction of hundreds of thousands of people's housing wealth, or certain, I don't know how many hundreds, but tremendous economic losses and joblessness and so on. A lot of the frustration with law enforcement reflects broader social and economic needs that are being left unaddressed. And the police end up bearing the burden of that, even though that's really not something that we can put at their doorstep.
Yeah. Let me turn our attention from the police to the rioters, the looters, the people who were throwing bottles and stones at the police and firing weapons at them, the people who came from elsewhere in Missouri and from elsewhere in the country, and who were up to no good, because while things seem, as we speak here, to be considerably calmer, let me knock on wood, there was a period there where things were very, very disturbing. And those heavy-handed police responsible from the locals and then from the National Guard being in there for a while and so on was to some degree justified by what was going on the ground. Now, I know you read Ed Banfield's book from decades ago, The Unheavenly City, and I can recall a chapter in that book titled something like Rioting for Fun and Profit, which was a reference to the social dynamic that gets underway when a circumstance like the one that we have here, where there are protests that are on the border of becoming quite disorderly, become perceived by actors whose motives are other than, noble, as opportunities. Wasn't that going on here to a certain degree? Or if you think so, what do you have to say about that? How does that balance off against what we were saying about the responsibilities?
Well, the police need to have a monopoly on the use of force, and they need to be able to keep us safe.
Okay.
Yeah, I actually thought one of the most poignant things was seeing what was happening in the looting of the stores, and the way that it's funny. This thing started. There was that leaked film of Michael Brown bullying the shopkeeper and stealing. Which was actually a terrible incident. I mean, it may be that the police should not have released that. But that it
did not redound to Michael Brown's
credit. No, it did not, and it certainly increased my assessment that at least I want to know what happened in his interaction with the police officer. This sort of fuck you nature of what he was doing, was kind of hard to miss. And of all of the, when the looting of the local small businesses that happens in these riots leaves such a lasting shadow, and it so often victimizes people who are themselves, just one rung ahead of the people in the street, and who are trying to make a go of it and make the community a place where people can live and shop, and it is despicable when. And they're not, and often, of course, these people might be Korean or African American, or once upon a time they were Jewish, and that enters. There's an element of ethnic antagonism that can sometimes enter that as well, and it's pretty disgusting. Yeah.
It's an ugly mix. I saw a recent piece by Fred Siegel, the guy at the City Journal or Manhattan Institute, wherever he is. Maybe right of center guy, but he was making this point. He says, you go riot if you want to, but I tell you what, it's death on the city or the town. It takes a long time to come back. He says, take a look at Newark, New Jersey. It never recovered from the riot of 1967. That was a half century ago.
I don't know the author at the moment, but there was an NBER working paper that suggested that places where it was raining heavily the night that Martin Luther King was killed did better economically quite a bit later.
That's Robert Margot. That's Robert Margot of Boston University, an economic historian. I know the paper very well. It was eventually published in the Brookings Papers. And they used the rainfall as an instrumental variable to account for variation across cities and find precisely that. I think that's the paper. Anyway, there is a paper by Robert Margot very much in that spirit that finds that looking 30 years later, at population, at business investment, at the value of property, and so on, negative effects from the riot after controlling for
who spoke?
et cetera. Because more people are going to come out.
By the way,
yeah,
someone
anyway,
who spoke very eloquently about this was Al Sharpton, who I just saw a video of him at a local church in Ferguson talking about, how they needed to control the looting and there's nothing that Fred Siegel, I imagine, would say in that article that Al Sharpton wouldn't, that you and I would agree with, that Al Sharpton didn't say. And one of the things that I think is striking in the coverage of an event like Ferguson, and we didn't talk about the role of the media in this, which is also obviously interesting, but if a lot of the coverage has been talking to younger people who are out on the street and who are quite angry about the way they are treated. And a lot of what they're saying is completely justified. You get a very different vibe if you just talk to people who are 15, 20 years older. They may be just as angry, but it's a different vibe. And it is, when people often say, the community needs to be represented, the community is a complicated thing. And certainly the African American community in Ferguson is a complicated group of people, and there's an awful lot of middle-aged people who are sitting at home who want the police to change the way they're behaving, but who are just not, have different views from a lot of the people that are going to be out there, talking to the television anchors. So we have to be. I think one of the things that we should learn from these experiences is there's an awful lot more going on underneath the surface and a much wider array of views about how the police should behave and what people want to see than is going to be reflected in the passionate moments of this kind of a thing.
I think this is I'm just going to say it's a wonderful point that you're making, that the quote unquote the black community is not monolithic, and that the images that come to us in the heat of the midnight rally are not a representative sampling of the opinions of that community.
I do. Can we talk a little bit more about police and the issue of violence that the police face?
Let's talk about it.
There's been such a number of incidents lately of tragic deaths. There's Eric Garner in Staten Island who got into it with police over selling loose cigarettes, and
the chokehold led to his demise.
Yes, and there was this man in St. Louis who apparently committed suicide by cop who was armed with a knife, and these two officers came and actually shot him within 30 seconds of their arrival.
Video is up on YouTube. I've watched it several times. The guy keeps coming when they have guns pointed at him and they command him to stop. It looks like there's something that could be a knife in his hand. He keeps coming straight at him. They pulled the trigger. Maybe there was another way of handling that situation, but I have to tell you, if I had been the cop, I might have pulled the trigger too, based on what I saw there.
I think I think you're making a very important point. And there were ways that might have been prevented if one had dealt with that situation before the police cars had pulled up. Presumably there's a history to why this guy snapped in that way and how they might have responded if they knew what his mental illness was. But if somebody's on you with a knife and you're an officer, it's very easy to sit here on blogging heads and say, well, I would have gotten in the car and rolled up the window. It is, but I think it is the great challenge that police officers face in many different settings is how to deal with non-compliant, illegal, or just strange behavior without the use of lethal force. And, one of the things that, as you and I, as you know, and regular listeners know, I care for someone who's intellectually disabled. The police have occasionally been involved in settings with my brother-in-law to help, and they'll send over a 25-year-old officer and you have someone who is non-compliant, who may not understand actually what they're being asked to do by the officer, and the officers don't really know how to respond. Their first responsibility is to keep themselves safe and to keep other people in the environment safe. And the way that's often inculcated in them is that they have to achieve basically dominance over the situation. And that is a really good way to deal with a robbery suspect most of the time. It is not necessarily the way that is going to work well with someone who has a psychiatric disorder. And
indeed,
yeah,
if you can
and
tell
of course,
the difference.
And in the ideal world, you have non-lethal weapons available, and you have a crisis intervention team, that could potentially be helpful in that situation. Most of those methods only work when you've achieved an environment of basic safety, so that you can actually calmly talk to the person. My friend Jesse Singal, who's doing great work at New York Magazine, just had a story up today where he did a really nice job of just talking to mental health professionals involved with policing about, okay, what do you do? And they were basically saying, boy, there's a lot of things that could be done better, but when they watch that video in that moment, it's unclear that person would have, if they had been in the shoes of the officers, it's not clear that the outcome would have been different. But that is...
It's a tragic thing to watch, too. It's very painful to watch. The guy is coming at him. These are two, they're standing there, their arms are together, extended in front of them in the classic pose with the gun at the end, and they're speaking out verbally, and he just keeps coming, and eventually, they shoot. And from a certain angle of vision, it looks like an execution. It looks, the guy is disheveled. He's evidently deranged. But there is something at the end of his arm that looks like it could be a weapon, and he doesn't obey their command.
And about somewhere between 10 and 30% of officer-involved shootings have an element of suicidal intent, and that is really a challenge. One of the ironies, by the way, is when someone does that, they tend to get shot more times because...
Wow, I didn't know that.
And,
There's data on that?
If you suppose that you're trying to get away from, you're an armed robbery suspect and you're trying to get away and you have a weapon and I shoot you a couple of times and you go down, and it's obvious you're not going to get away.
So they can stop shooting, but if you're coming at the guy and you got to put him down, and then
and also just you're more if the your own intentions and behavior are so hard to interpret that that provides another reason to really to really make sure that you're incapacitated. And it's just, what's so tragic about it is, first of all, that we leave the police. We've made the police the frontline responders to an awful lot of things they're poorly equipped to deal with.
I think that's a major point, Harold. They're not mental health workers. They're not social workers.
And also these small, imagine that you're a police department in a small, like in our case, so the group home that Vincent lives in and the facilities that he goes to, it's in some little town in the south side of, the Chicago Southland. So if the police are called, it's not as if you can have, it's not like in the city of Chicago where you might have a dedicated unit of people with special training to deal with the intellectually disabled. It's a police officer in a small town, and who may have gotten an in-service at some point, but who's obviously, they can't specialize in that way when you have a couple of dozen officers.
Yeah. Let
Sure.
me move us to a slightly different ground if I can.
Sure.
Still on Ferguson, though. So here's the officer. I forget his name.
Darren Wilson.
He Darren Wilson. That sounded like an African-American name to me when I first heard it. But he's white. So 6 shots are fired. Okay. Witnesses are saying that the man was trying to surrender and that he was gunned down. At least some witnesses are saying that. There's conflicting. We don't know exactly what happened. Calls are being issued for justice. We want justice. We want justice. Clearly, in the minds of the people issuing those calls, and there are many of them, and some of them are in public office, justice means indicting and punishing this police officer for murdering this teenager. Now, we don't know the facts. Okay? I don't want to sound like a Fox News anchor. He's innocent until proven guilty. He deserves the presumption of innocence. Okay? We can't possibly run a country with mobs deciding who gets indicted and grand juries and prosecutors bringing people into the dock out of fear that there will be a riot and sustained disorder.
Sorry, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Now, so let me just finish. My question is, where is the public leader, whether at the Justice Department or anywhere else, who's prepared to make his or her definition of civil rights and justice inclusive of the point I'm just making, which is that Darren Wilson deserves the presumption of innocence, and we can't have mobs deciding who gets indicted?
I think that's a good point. I would just add a couple of things to that. One is that the completely bungled and brutal police response made it much harder to
leaving that body laying in the middle of the street all those
that made
hours,
it much harder to give justice to Darren Wilson for what happened.
Not naming who the officer was involved in the shooting, etc. I mean, we could go down the litany of the things that they did wrong, but I hear you. That did not help.
I think we have to honor the humanity of both the victim and the perpetrator of this. And it is, I've been out with police officers at night in Englewood, where at one point there were, they had a bunch of guys spread out, hands on the hood of the car, and there's this, one guy, and these two officers with, quite a few people that they had to deal with in that moment, and it is, and they, by the way, these guys were incredibly polite and respectful. They were very authoritative, but they were. And I think they did that in part for their own safety. They're not looking to provoke any kind of confrontation. If you are out there and someone puts a hand on you and you're an officer, I find it at some human level understandable that a person could lose it, in that moment, and whatever happened, we have to. I don't want to prejudge that. And I also want to be my assessment is that he committed a completely unjustified homicide. I think that part of I feel some level of compassion towards an officer who would make a very tragic set of mistakes that led to a person's death. That is also in the mix without in any way justifying, it seems to me 6 bullets in this young man and then leaving the body in the street. If he were my brother, I would, I would be livid, and I might well be out in the street protesting. My wife, Veronica, has been, she's just absolutely ballistic, and she would certainly be out there as well. We at least owe some. There should be some period of reflection so that we can actually figure out what happened, and I do hope that we get to that point. I actually didn't mind that they didn't release the officer's name initially, because I thought, let's make sure that this person's safe, and there are a lot of other things. They could have revealed how many times Michael Brown had been shot. And they could have given some explanation of why his body had to be left out in the street, and why, 5 other things that they needed to explain.
I gather they did not release an incident report about the shooting in a timely fashion, and there was a lot of complaint from the press about that. And I guess we'll learn in due course the full story. About
and they obviously released that video, that store video, as that was a strategically timed release.
It looks like it. It looks like it was designed to, quote, assassinate character, close quote, or at least to, raise doubt about whether the officer might not have been justified, because, we saw this very unlovely behavior by Michael Brown as he strong-armed his way out of that store. And so you're invited to think he might have behaved with the cop in a similar way, and the cop might have lost it, and maybe, he overreacted and killed this guy, but this guy was not a choir boy.
Now, of course,
that's what they seem to be.
Because ideally, the police department are trained to deal with people who are not choir boys without killing them. I mean,
without killing them, right? People who boost a box of cigars from the store don't warrant to be shot to death for that reason, even if they get belligerent when you're trying to stop them and search them. But that brings me back to something you said earlier, which I thought was interesting. And I spent some time when I was at the Kennedy School around people like Mark Moore. You will remember him, and Jim Wilson. They studied policing. They'd have executive sessions where police would come in. There's a technique, a science, as it were, to policing. And this issue of controlling the situation by having unquestioned dominance and authority, seems to be a part of the kind of lexicon of policing tactics. I mean, the way that you keep your position is to make sure that nobody F's with you and that people do what you say. They follow your orders. There was a piece in the Washington Post, perhaps you saw it, by a former police officer who basically says, if you don't want to get hurt by the police, then do what we damn say. Yeah. Okay? In other words, when I stop you, I don't know if you're a nice guy or a murderer. I don't know if you're armed or not. I don't know what's going to happen. When I ask you to step out of the vehicle, I have a reason for that. Don't give me an argument about whether or not I was justified in stopping you. If you want to file a case, wait until after the encounter is over and go to the relevant authorities and file your case if I misbehave. You have a right to ask me certain kind of questions. You have a right not to, you don't have to open your car door if I don't have a search warrant, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. But behave politely and let this encounter be over. Most stops take 2 or 3 minutes. Can't you obey for that long? I am the duly constituted authority, after all. And by the way, if you mess with me, I'll hurt you. Now, I'm not endorsing that. I'm not endorsing it at all, okay? But I'm just saying there must be some protocol that the police will have to follow to manage their interactions, especially when they're dealing with a diverse population that includes some people who are bad actors or worse. So what's wrong with the idea that the time to argue with the cop is not when he's asking you on your doorstep in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to produce an ID to prove that you actually do own the home. The time to argue with the cop is after you've shown him the ID, satisfied him that you're the legitimate homeowner, and then you go down to the department and you file a complaint that the guy was impolite or that he shouldn't have been harassing you. Well, the only thing I would say to that, I mean, it's certainly a fact that police will behave if they feel that their own safety is at issue. They will behave quite differently, and we can understand why. But by the way, excuse me for interrupting. It's their authority that's the thing that they have to protect. Well, I think two things. One is I think those two things have to be separated, and that police legitimacy has to be earned. And it's not earned necessarily at the level of the individual officer. It's earned at the level of the dynamic between the police department and the community in a broader way. And when that legitimacy is open to reasonable question, that authority is going to be challenged in a different way. Now, it doesn't mean that somebody has a right to shove you, but it may mean that people are not going to give you automatically the grant of your authority that you might wish them to have, that you might wish them to grant you. And a successful police officer has to be able to distinguish and to understand, you owe me that I am safe. If you're a citizen and I'm an officer and you behave in a way that threatens my safety, I have a right to respond to be safe. If you are obnoxious to me, I don't have the right to enforce my authority by getting physical with you. And there was an arrogance and a presumption to that essay that I understand where it's coming from, but he's making an unreasonable demand because he's in the if somebody comes up to Harold Pollack, when I walk home at night from University of Chicago, my office, I pass about. Usually I pass literally 5 or 10 officers on my way to the train late at night. They sort of patrol Hyde Park very heavily. Yeah. And I basically feel like these are people,
that are, I'm totally happy that they're there. I never have a negative encounter with them whatsoever. They keep me safe. I would, if one of them asks me for something, I'm going to completely have a positive encounter with them. If I'm a young African American walking around Chicago and I've been hassled by a lot of cops, I may not be quite as polite. Maybe I should be. Maybe if I'm that person's dad, I'm saying, make sure to be really polite to those cops. But those cops have to understand that attitude isn't coming out of nowhere. Yeah.
I get it, Harold. I think you're educating me in a way. The point's really important. I mean, sometimes when the police act badly react badly to a person's, not respecting their authority, and they, like arrest Henry Louis Gates Jr. on his doorstep, it's called contempt of cop. You got arrested for contempt of cop because you didn't respect the cop's authority and the cop reacted or overreacted to that situation. But there's also such a thing as the cop having contempt of the people. Presuming that because you're young, male, and African American, your hair is in dreadlocks, you're wearing a certain sneakers and your pants are low slung on your hip, that you're a thug, that you're a murderer, and they treat you like you're a thug, or because you don't speak the English language impeccably, you haven't been particularly well educated, your skin is dark, you're ghetto, quote unquote, in your orientation, that they presume that therefore you just came out of a crack house, that you're a whore trying to ply your sexual trafficking trade or whatever it might be. In other words, they treat you with contempt. So it's a two-way street. Cops deserve not to be treated with contempt. They have a difficult job to do. The least you can do is politely respond to them if they're behaving in a normal manner when they stop you. But by the same token, the police have the responsibility not
What's
to treat their
striking
subjects
about
with contempt.
I agree with what you just said is it is not within the power of the individual young person being stopped or the individual officer to completely escape the larger social and economic and racial dynamic that we all live in. And, from the point of view of those officers, I'm sure those officers face a lot of provocations on the streets of Ferguson or the streets of Chicago. And from their, in the life in their reality, they're like, why are people in the community not supporting us? Why are a lot of people real assholes to us without people in the community backing us up? That's the reality that a lot of officers experience. And of course, from the community's perspective, they've got a very different reality where those officers are representing an authority that has not served them well or served them with complete legitimacy. And I think effective public management of the police force has to somehow say, okay, this is where we are. This gets us back to the beginning of our conversation. You are the police chief of Ferguson, Missouri. This is who your officers are. You got a large proportion of crew-cutted white guys compared to what maybe you'd like to see for whatever reason in this community at this moment. This is how we're going to do our job. And this is how we're going to approach. Here's a bunch of situations. By the way, this also gets back to the drug war. And are there certain order maintenance activities that we're going to do differently given that this is our situation? Maybe we don't arrest every guy selling drugs that we could possibly arrest. Maybe we do things a little different.
Or go in with a SWAT team and breaking down the door of the grandmother's house where the 18-year-old drug dealer kid is staying, with one of these no-knock things and having the community be terrorized by that kind of event over and over again. Have you seen, by the way, Alice Kaufman's book, On the Run?
I haven't read it yet. I read a review.
I
know a little bit about it. I've read some excerpts, and I read a review in the New Yorker. It's funny. I had a very negative reaction to the Malcolm Gladwell review. I don't know if you happened.
I haven't seen Gladwell's review. I'm sorry to hear that because I like the book and the author very much. But I only want to mention, she's embedded, deep embedded. She starts as an undergraduate living over in this inner city Philadelphia neighborhood and getting to know people and carries it all the way through her PhD. She's at Penn as an undergraduate. She goes to Princeton and commutes to her classes at Princeton from this inner city neighborhood where she's been living for like 6 or 8 years. She gets to know a bunch of guys. You could call them a crew. She calls it the 6th Street, guys, because her fictional geographic location is 6th Street, but it's some concrete place in North Philly or West Philly. And she basically reports on what it means in their lives that they all have warrants out and they're susceptible in a traffic stop, or if they go to the hospital to see one of their buddies who's a gunshot victim, or if they show up for a court date to be, taken into custody. And it's about the interactions of these people and their associates, their wives and mothers and grandmothers and so on, with the police. And it's just a firsthand account. I'm not saying it's perfect by any means, but it's gripping. And there's a lot of this. They battered down the door. They came in. They threatened to take the children away from, the guy's girlfriend if she doesn't tell them where he's hiding out. They are, belligerent, contemptuous, violent, and so forth. The cops are. She says she witnessed numerous times where somebody was beaten by police officers on the street. They don't always file a case. They don't always get the attention of the press, but it happens way more often.
They're dispensing a little street justice.
Yeah. And the strategies that these people, I'm sorry to interrupt, but just to finish, the strategies that these people evolve, the impact on the relationships that they have with their loved ones, or the fact that their freedom is tenuous, the whole kind of complex social, psychological implication of the fact that they are, quote, on the run, close quote. That's the book.
It sounds like I should read the book. We've clearly criminalized a much larger population than we've had to, particularly over the drug issue, that in a way that's so damaging communities in Philadelphia and Chicago and so many other places. But one of the ironies of this is I would like to see us focus in a more serious way on the gun offenders, and because that's really what's leading to the deaths, is people walking around carrying guns and getting into it with people. Is very hard to get a community buy-in to aggressive policing in the gun area in a context of over-incarceration and all the stuff that you just talked about from Alice Goffman's book. That we have undermined the legitimacy of the process. I do feel so. Absolutely, your point's well taken. There is one irony in some of the recent discussion about demilitarizing the police, where there's this supposed convergence between right and left that we've over-militarized the police. Some of the people on the right who are criticizing militarizing the police are the same people who are opposing more sensible regulation of guns. And there's a reason why the police are so militarized. The police in a Western European city, when the police come to arrest you, they really don't think you're going to be packing high power rifles.
No, I get it. The police have to be just one degree better armed than the assailants, and to the extent that you say have a right to bear arms, you're going to have a police force
and it is. We have to somehow deal with that. But it's there's a lot more work to be done. We may have.
I think there's.
Yes.
I think we've reached a natural stopping point. Excuse me for cutting you off, but I got to run, and I want to summarize the thing by saying something like, order maintenance is an achievement cooperatively reached between the citizenry and the police. And soft power is every bit as important as brute force from the police's point of view in achieving this cooperative outcome. I'm glad you think so. Thanks very much, Harold, for the conversation. I think we at least scratched the surface of this complex issue. Look forward to talking to you next time.